A piano that plays itself, but only after midnight. Welcome to Midnight Confessions. I am your host, Danny. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. Your comments mean the world to me. Let's begin. It was a soft golden afternoon in St. Mary Mead, the kind that seemed to stretch languidly between the chime of the church clock and the distant hum of bees. The villagers, accustomed to the rhythm of quiet gossip and blooming gardens, could hardly have imagined that by the end of the week their peace would be fractured by something most dreadful indeed. Mrs. Bantry's annual charity concert was, by all accounts, the highlight of early summer. The event had been planned with her usual flair, a blend of local talent and just enough scandalous novelty to keep everyone talking until the harvest fair. The main attraction this year was Mr. Lionel Drake, a recently arrived musician who had taken up residence at the old parsonage, a handsome man in his 40s with impeccable manners, curious habits, and a past that no one could quite pin down. Miss Marple, sitting among the crowd in the village hall, adjusted her lace gloves and smiled gently as Lionel Drake's fingers danced across the piano keys. The melody, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat, drifted with an almost hypnotic grace. She noticed how Mrs. Price Ridley dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, while young Tommy Simmons, who fancied himself a composer, leaned forward in admiration. To anyone else it was a lovely performance, but Miss Marple, with her needle-sharp perception, saw something else, the pianist's eyes darting briefly toward the back door every few measures. At the interval, tea and seed cake were served in the adjoining room. There was laughter, polite chatter, and a small quarrel about whether the vicar's new sermon was too long. Lionel Drake excused himself early, citing a headache. Several people noticed he looked rather pale. By 11 that night, the concert was only a pleasant memory for most. The moon hung full above the sleeping village. Miss Marple, settling her knitting beside her bed, thought she heard the faintest sound carried on the night air, a single note of piano music striking through the stillness. She smiled to herself. "Someone practicing late," she murmured. Or perhaps someone unsettled. The next morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a grim discovery. The old parsonage stood silent, its curtains drawn. The housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, knocked twice before entering, and found Mr. Lionel Drake slumped beside the grand piano, quite dead. One hand rested on the keys, pressing a discordant note that seemed to linger in the air. And though no one could have said why, several villagers would later swear that, sometime after midnight, the piano had been playing by itself. The news spread through St. Mary Mead like ripples from a stone cast into still water. By 8:30, the milkman had told the postmistress, who had told the vicar's wife, who had told the doctor's sister, and by 9 o'clock, the whole village knew that Mr. Lionel Drake had been found dead at the old parsonage. Speculation bloomed as naturally as daisies in spring. Mrs. Bantry was among the first to arrive at the scene, under the respectable pretense of offering comfort to Mrs. Finch. "Such a dreadful shock," she whispered to Miss Marple, who had been quietly walking along the lane and was now peering through the open gate. "And so soon after that lovely performance. You don't suppose he took something, do you?" Miss Marple's pale blue eyes rested thoughtfully on the ivy-clad walls of the parsonage. "One never likes to suppose," she said gently, "though human nature, I find, seldom acts without reason. People are rarely as mysterious as they appear, only their motives are." Inside, Inspector Craddock had already taken charge, his hat tilted forward and his expression grim. He was fond of Miss Marple, though her quiet insights had a habit of making his official conclusions seem slightly premature. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said with a reluctant smile. "You've heard, I suppose. The doctor thinks he's been dead since sometime after midnight. No sign of forced entry, no struggle. Heart failure, perhaps. But we'll see what the coroner says." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, glancing toward the grand piano where the final note of Mr. Drake's life still seemed to hang in the air. "I wonder," she murmured. "Did anyone hear music last night?" Craddock frowned. "Funny you mention it. Mrs. Price Ridley swears she did, something faint around midnight, but she's rather hard of hearing, and she admits she might have dreamt it." Miss Marple's expression was mild, but her mind had already begun its quiet, methodical work. If music had indeed been played after Mr. Drake's death, someone else must have been in the room. The key question was who and why by noon. The village was alive with theories. Mrs. Bantry confided to the grocer that Mr. Drake had been involved in some sort of business abroad. Mrs. Hartnell declared it was undoubtedly a case of romantic revenge. Those artistic types are never stable. Meanwhile, young Tommy Simmons insisted he'd once seen Mr. Drake arguing with a man near the post office, though he couldn't quite recall the man's face. Miss Marple listened to all of it with the polite attentiveness of someone who appeared to be mildly amused by village chatter. In truth, she was piecing together fragments of truth from a tangle of invention. She recalled quite distinctly how Mr. Drake's gaze had flicked toward the back door during his performance, and how he'd left early with a pale, distracted air. There was something or someone he'd been expecting. That afternoon she called on Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, under the pretext of delivering a basket of scones. The poor woman was trembling as she poured tea. "He was a good man, miss, quiet and polite," she said tearfully. "But lately he seemed troubled. I heard him pacing some nights, talking to himself. Yesterday he said he might be getting visitors. He told me not to wait up." "Visitors?" Miss Marple's tone was soft yet purposeful. "Did he say who they were?" Mrs. Finch shook her head. "No, miss. Only that he'd unlock the back door in case they arrived late." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, her thoughts knitting themselves together as neatly as her yarn. "And the piano?" she asked. "Was it locked?" "Oh, no, miss. He always kept it open. Said it helped him think, having the keys under his fingers." As Miss Marple left the house, she paused by the garden gate. The roses trembled faintly in the warm breeze, and somewhere a blackbird called. The village, outwardly so peaceful, seemed to hold its breath. There was something curiously wrong about it all. Too neat, too convenient. A man found dead beside his piano, with no sign of intrusion and no witnesses. And yet, the unlocked door, the whispered visitors, and that faint trace of music after midnight all spoke of something darker and far more deliberate. Miss Marple stood very still, watching a young constable carry away a covered object from the parsonage. It looked like a small leather case, the sort musicians used to keep their sheet music in. Her eyes lingered on it, her mind quietly storing the detail for later. As she turned back toward the village, she murmured, "When one invites a guest in secret, one must be quite sure they mean no harm." Poor Mr. Drake seems to have misjudged the company he kept, and though she smiled politely at Mrs. Price Ridley, who called out from across the lane to share yet another rumour, Miss Marple's thoughts were already elsewhere, circling, like a cat around a mouse-hole, closer and closer to the hidden truth. That evening, as dusk folded itself softly over the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting needles clinking faintly in the quiet room. The scent of lilac drifted through the air, but her thoughts were elsewhere, lingering on the curious details of Lionel Drake's death. A man expecting late visitors, an unlocked door, and the faint echo of piano music at midnight. It was all too irregular for mere coincidence. She replayed the scene in her mind, the body slumped beside the piano, the hand resting on the keys. Death by natural causes, the doctor had said, perhaps a weak heart. But Miss Marple knew better. Death, when it came naturally, rarely arranged itself so tidily. And there had been something unspoken in Mrs. Finch's frightened manner, as though the woman were holding back out of loyalty or fear. The next morning she paid a casual visit to the grocer's, where conversation flowed freely between bags of flour and gossip. Mrs. Bantry was already there, buying raspberry jam she didn't need. They say the inspector's bringing in that young man from the post office, she whispered eagerly. The one who claimed to see Mr. Drake arguing last week. He's quite sure it was about money. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Money often does make tempers rise, she said, though I've noticed quarrels over love are rather more violent. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened with delight. You don't think there was a woman involved? My dear, Miss Marple replied mildly, when there's a man with secrets, there's usually a woman somewhere nearby. She continued her walk, stopping now and then to chat with villagers under the pretense of concern. It was in this way she learned that Mr. Drake had occasionally been visited by a smartly dressed lady from London, blonde, elegant and decidedly out of place in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. No one knew her name, though Mrs. Price Ridley had of course seen her with her own eyes getting into the 3:15 train to Paddington just 2 days before the concert. When Miss Marple returned home, she found Inspector Craddock waiting at her gate. You'll be amused to know, he said, tipping his hat. The autopsy found nothing conclusive. No poison, no wounds, just heart failure as expected. Though I'd stake my pension there's more to it. I imagine you'd be right, Miss Marple said, leading him toward her garden bench. Tell me, Inspector, was there anything peculiar among his belongings? He frowned thoughtfully. A few letters from a music publisher, some bank papers and that leather case. Empty, as it happens. Not a sheet of music in it. Empty, Miss Marple repeated softly. How curious. One would expect a musician to guard his compositions quite jealously. Unless, of course, they were already in someone else's hands. Craddock gave her a sidelong glance. You think someone took them? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked briskly. Oh, not for the music itself, perhaps. But if a piece of paper holds evidence, say a letter disguised as a score, it would be quite the clever hiding place. People rarely look for words between the bars of music. The inspector chuckled, though there was a touch of respect in his voice. You always see patterns where the rest of us see noise. I merely notice what others overlook, she said kindly. People reveal far more than they intend to, even in the smallest gestures. Later that day, as the constable was taking statements, young Tommy Simons came forward again. His account was hesitant, yet Miss Marple listened with grave attention as he described seeing Mr. Drake meeting a stranger by the lane near the vicarage the day before the concert. The man had worn a brown coat and a felt hat pulled low, nothing remarkable except for the briefcase he carried. A briefcase? Craddock asked sharply. Could it have been the same one found at the parsonage? Tommy nodded uncertainly. It looked the same. Leather with brass corners. After he left, Miss Marple turned to the inspector. You see, my dear Craddock, we may have 2 cases instead of 1. The briefcase taken and then returned, or a duplicate perhaps to conceal the theft. As evening deepened, Miss Marple walked once more past the old parsonage. The windows were dark now, sealed by police tape, but she paused, listening to the faint creak of branches and the whisper of the wind through ivy. In the silence, she could almost imagine the piano's lonely chord echoing through the night again. She bent to pick up a fallen scrap of paper near the gate, a torn corner of sheet music, faintly marked with pencil notations. Her keen eyes caught something odd. The notes, when read closely, formed an unnatural pattern, repeating in a way that suggested not melody, but code. She slipped it into her handbag without a word and walked on, her step steady, her expression serene. Inside her mind, however, thoughts were spinning fast and precise as the gears of a clock. Lionel Drake's death, the mysterious visitor, the missing music, all threads of the same pattern. She would wait, as she always did, for the next small piece to fall into place. Because in St. Mary Mead, secrets never stayed buried for long. They merely waited, like the last note of a nocturne, to be played again. The following morning dawned grey and heavy, with a mist that clung to the hedgerows like secrets reluctant to disperse. Miss Marple, dressed neatly in her pale blue cardigan, walked down to the post office under the guise of sending a letter to her niece. In truth, She was thinking about the scrap of sheet music folded carefully inside her reticule. She had spent part of the night examining it under her lamp, tracing the peculiar arrangement of notes. They did not form a melody. Rather, they repeated in a rhythm too deliberate to be musical, almost as if it were a message disguised in plain sight. The village, meanwhile, hummed with new theories. Mrs. Bantry now insisted that the London lady was Mr. Drake's wife, or worse, his lover, and that she had murdered him out of jealousy. Mrs. Price Ridley had switched her suspicion to the housekeeper, claiming Mrs. Finch looked the sort to keep arsenic in the pantry. Even the vicar had been drawn into conversation about the moral frailty of artists, much to his wife's quiet mortification. Miss Marple listened to all this at the post-office queue, nodding kindly as she purchased her stamps. The clamour of gossip was useful in its own way. It revealed which details people remembered and which they chose to forget. Human nature, she mused, was rather like embroidery. What appeared neat on the surface was often tangled beneath. When she left, she found Inspector Craddock waiting outside in his motor car, looking somewhat harried. "You'll be pleased to know, Miss Marple," he said dryly, "we've tracked down the lady from London. Name of Mrs. Clara Wentworth. Claims she was Mr. Drake's patron. Says she supported his compositions financially. Strictly professional, she insists." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Patronage can be a delicate thing, Inspector. A benefactor's generosity often comes with expectations, spoken or otherwise," he sighed. "She's to arrive this afternoon for questioning. Perhaps you'd like to join us." "Oh, I shouldn't dream of interfering," Miss Marple said gently, though her tone suggested the opposite. When Mrs. Clara Wentworth arrived at the police station, she was everything the villagers had imagined: elegant, poised, and faintly theatrical. Her blonde hair was perfectly set, her gloved hands immaculate, yet her composure had a brittle edge, as though she were holding herself together by sheer will. "I was terribly fond of Mr. Drake," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "He was a genius, sensitive, misunderstood. He didn't deserve this." Craddock leaned forward. "You visited him 2 days before his death. What was the purpose of that meeting?" "Business," she replied quickly. "He'd promised me a new composition, something special. I'd already advanced him funds. But he seemed distracted, nervous even. He said someone had been following him." Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner as if by accident, looked up from her knitting. "Did he say who, dear?" Mrs. Wentworth hesitated. "No, only that it was a man from his past. He wouldn't elaborate." "I thought it was nonsense. He could be so dramatic." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. "And the composition? Did he show it to you?" The woman's eyes flickered. "He said it wasn't ready. I never saw a note of it." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, returning to her knitting. "How disappointing for you." After Mrs. Wentworth had gone, Craddock exhaled heavily. "She's hiding something." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "And like most deceptions, I dare say it's less grand than it appears. People rarely lie about what matters most. They lie about what embarrasses them." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the old parsonage once more, under the pretense of delivering flowers. The constable on duty, knowing her reputation, allowed her a brief look inside. She moved through the drawing-room slowly, taking in the scent of polish and dust. On the piano stood a small vase, roses wilted now. She bent to examine them and noticed faint smudges of red on the rim, as though someone had handled them roughly. Lipstick, perhaps. Her gaze shifted to the carpet beneath the piano stool. The fibers were faintly indented. 2 separate impressions side by side, as though someone else had been seated there recently. A duet, perhaps, or an observer close enough to watch Mr. Drake's hands as he played his final piece. That evening, as twilight deepened over the village, Miss Marple sat once more by her lamp. She took out the fragment of coded sheet music and studied it with fresh eyes. The repeating pattern of notes seemed to correspond to letters, she realized, a simple substitution, not unlike the puzzles in the Times. Slowly, patiently, she worked it out. When the final word revealed itself, she sat back, lips pressed together in quiet satisfaction. The message was brief but unmistakable. Debt paid. She folded the paper carefully away, her expression thoughtful. "So not a matter of passion after all," she murmured, "but of obligation and revenge, perhaps." Outside, the night air was still, but somewhere in the distance a single piano note drifted faintly on the breeze. Miss Marple looked up sharply, then smiled. "How very interesting," she whispered, as if the village itself had just offered her another clue. The next morning was crisp and bright, the mist of the previous day burned away by a shy autumn sun. Miss Marple, after her customary breakfast of tea and toast, sat quietly in her sitting room, gazing at the folded scrap of coded music that now lay upon her desk. Debt paid. Such a simple phrase, and yet in her experience those were the most dangerous of all. People did dreadful things under the banner of debt. Money, love or pride, it mattered little which. A knock came at the door. It was Inspector Craddock, looking as though he hadn't slept well. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I thought you might like an update." He accepted her offer of tea gratefully before continuing. "We had another look through Drake's personal papers. His bank account's nearly empty, though large sums passed through it in the last few months. Looks like someone was paying him privately, and recently too." Miss Marple poured the tea with steady hands. "And Mrs. Wentworth claims the payments were hers, advances for his work. But I checked with her bank. She sent him only one large payment 6 months ago. Nothing since." "Then someone else was paying him," Miss Marple said softly. "Perhaps someone connected to this mysterious debt." Craddock nodded. "That's what I thought. We're looking into his correspondence. There's a mention of a man named Arthur." "No surname." Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. "Arthur," she repeated. "A solid sort of name. Dependable, perhaps, or someone who wished to appear so." The inspector looked at her shrewdly. "You've thought of something." "Only that men who are owed rarely write notes of gratitude," she said, smiling faintly. "They prefer to collect their due in person." After he left, Miss Marple decided to take a walk toward the edge of the village, where the old mill road ran past a cluster of cottages. One belonged to Mr. Finch, the housekeeper's brother, a quiet man who kept to himself, but who, according to Mrs. Price Ridley, knew everyone's business without ever leaving his doorstep. He was in his garden when she arrived, pruning roses with a care that spoke of patience and habit. "Good morning, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple called cheerfully. "I was hoping to ask you something about your sister." He looked up, startled, then nodded cautiously. "You mean about Mr. Drake, ma'am?" "Terrible business, that. My sister's beside herself." "Yes, indeed. She told me he'd been expecting visitors that night." He hesitated. She mentioned it to me, too. Said he seemed nervous, and now she's worried sick she didn't lock up after him. Keeps saying if she had, maybe—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "One mustn't blame oneself for another's fate, Mr. Finch. Still, I wonder, did your sister ever mention whether Mr. Drake had friends outside the village?" He frowned in thought. "Just the one, I think. Fellow used to come down in a motor car, dark coat, kept his hat low. My sister thought he was some sort of agent. She said Mr. Drake always grew quiet after those visits. Once I heard her say he'd called the man Arthur." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Arthur. Yes, that name seems to be coming up rather a lot." As she returned along the lane, she reflected on what she had learned. The secret visitor, the hidden payments, and the coded message. It was all fitting together, piece by piece. But there was one element still out of place, the piano. Why had it played after midnight? Who would have risked being heard in such a small, watchful village? That evening she decided to test a theory. She asked Inspector Craddock if she might see the parsonage once more, ostensibly to confirm something she'd forgotten. He agreed, though he seemed doubtful. Together they entered the dim drawing-room. "Now, Inspector," she said gently, Would you be so kind as to press that same note upon the piano key where Mr. Drake's hand was found?" He did. The sound rang out, a lingering melancholy chord that quivered through the air. When he released it, Miss Marple nodded toward the far wall. "You see how the curtains stir? There's a draught. If the window were slightly ajar, that note might sustain just long enough to give the impression of playing itself." Craddock looked impressed. "So the piano wasn't playing after death, it was the wind." "Perhaps," she said mildly, "or perhaps someone wished us to think so." As they left, her eyes caught on something glinting in the firelight near the skirting board, a tiny fragment of brass, half hidden beneath the rug. She bent and picked it up. It was the corner hinge of a briefcase, broken clean off. Later, as she sat by her fire, she placed the brass piece beside the coded music and the memory of that lipstick-stained vase. Together they formed a picture that was beginning to sharpen. A patron who lied, a debt repaid, a visitor named Arthur, and a man whose past had finally caught up with him in a quiet English village. Miss Marple smiled to herself, her knitting lying untouched on her lap. "There's always the small details that speak the loudest," she murmured. "And this one, I fancy, has begun to sing." The following day arrived with a restless wind that rattled the garden gate outside Miss Marple's cottage and sent the scent of rain through the air. She had not slept much. Her mind had turned ceaselessly over the details of the case, the coded message, the mysterious Arthur, the empty briefcase, and the faint lipstick mark on the vase by the piano. Each clue seemed small enough on its own, yet together they whispered of something deliberate, something practiced. Murder, Miss Marple knew, was rarely impulsive. It was most often the result of long habits of deceit. At 10:30, Inspector Craddock called again, his face lined with frustration. "We've traced this Arthur fellow," he began. "Arthur Denham. Used to be Drake's business partner years ago. They were music agents in London, organizing performances, collecting royalties, that sort of thing. It ended badly. Denham went bankrupt. Drake disappeared abroad for a few years, and when he came back he had a new name and a good deal of money. Denham swore Drake cheated him, but there was never proof." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "So a debt indeed, perhaps one not quite settled." Craddock nodded grimly. "Denham's been living in Oxfordshire these past 2 years, working as a salesman. We've sent for him. If he's involved, he'll hang himself in conversation soon enough." "That depends," Miss Marple said softly, "on whether he's clever or desperate." By afternoon, Arthur Denham had arrived at the station. Miss Marple, under the polite pretext of bringing Inspector Craddock his forgotten umbrella, found herself conveniently present when the man was ushered in. Denham was lean, neatly dressed, his manner restrained but his eyes restless. He looked like a man accustomed to being careful with words. "I heard about Drake," he said after a long pause. "Terrible thing. We had our differences, but I'd no reason to wish him harm." Craddock's tone was measured. "You visited him recently, didn't you? A neighbor saw you near the old parsonage the night before he died." Denham's jaw tightened. "I went to collect what was owed. That's all. He promised me a share in a deal years ago, never paid it. When I found out he was living comfortably again, I thought it only fair to remind him." "And did he pay?" The man hesitated, then exhaled. "He gave me an envelope. Said it was the last I'd get from him. I left that night." Miss Marple, standing by the door with an expression of vague benevolence, spoke gently. "How odd, then, that Mr. Drake should die soon after your visit. And that a small scrap of music should be found coded with the words 'debt paid.' Almost poetic, don't you think?" Denham's gaze flicked toward her wary. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," she said kindly. "But I don't imagine you killed him, Mr. Denham. That would have required a touch of theatricality, and you seem a most practical man." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Then who do you think did?" Miss Marple's smile was serene. "The person who had most to lose by the settling of that debt." After Denham was dismissed, Craddock gave her a sharp look. "You're playing at something, Miss Marple." "You think he's innocent?" "I think," she replied, "he was meant to appear guilty. Mr. Drake's murderer needed a man with motive and history, a convenient ghost from the past, someone who could be counted on to visit, to argue and to leave before the deed was done." "It's all very neat," Craddock frowned. "Then who?" She hesitated, glancing toward the window where rain now streaked down the glass. "Have you noticed, Inspector, how perfectly placed that lipstick stain was on the vase? Not the mark of a woman passing through, but of someone arranging flowers, someone who belonged in that room." "Mrs. Finch?" he said in surprise. "Oh, no," Miss Marple said softly. "Mrs. Finch would never wear lipstick to clean vases. But Mrs. Wentworth might, especially if she wished to leave behind the impression of a visit long past." Craddock blinked. "You're saying she was there that night?" "I'm saying she might never have left at all," Miss Marple replied. "She had motive enough. Drake was blackmailing her, perhaps over those financial advances, and if he'd finally decided to end the arrangement, she may have decided to end him instead." Craddock stared at her for a moment, then straightened. "We'll question her again." That evening, as Miss Marple watched the inspector's car disappear down the lane, she folded her hands in her lap and sighed. It was always unpleasant, she thought, when the truth began to surface. Like mud stirred from the bottom of a pond, it clouded the water before it cleared it. Yet one detail still troubled her: the brass hinge from the briefcase. Why had it been broken? She rose and crossed to her writing desk, where it lay beside the coded paper. As she examined it under the lamplight, a realization dawned. The break was not accidental. It had been pried loose, as if someone had forced the case open. If Mrs. Wentworth had indeed returned that night, she had not come merely to argue. She had come for what was inside the briefcase, something worth killing for. Miss Marple set the hinge down and smiled faintly. "The truth," she murmured, "is always in the smallest hinge of a door or of a lie." The rain had settled into a soft, persistent drizzle by the time Inspector Craddock returned the next afternoon. Miss Marple, expecting him, had already laid out a fresh pot of tea and a plate of shortbread. He entered with a look that told her he had news, though whether it was good or not remained uncertain. "She's broken, Miss Marple," he said, sitting heavily. Mrs. Wentworth confessed she went back to the old parsonage that night, claimed she only wanted to retrieve some letters Mr. Drake was keeping, personal ones. He'd threatened to expose them to her husband if she didn't continue paying him. "She insists he was alive when she left." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression one of mild sympathy. "A familiar story and not an implausible one. I imagine she thought the blackmail would end with his death." Craddock leaned forward. "But the letters, there's the curious thing. We found them. They were in his briefcase, along with a small fortune in cash. All untouched." "How very odd," Miss Marple murmured. "Then whatever Mrs. Wentworth came for, she didn't find it," he frowned. "If she didn't take the money, what else could she have wanted?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Something that could destroy her reputation, perhaps, or someone else's." She rose, crossed to her writing desk, and handed him the fragment of brass. "I believe this fell from that briefcase, and if I'm not mistaken, someone pried it open rather hastily. Not Mrs. Wentworth, she's too refined for such clumsiness, but someone desperate or frightened." Craddock turned the piece over in his hand. "You think there was something hidden inside?" "I think," she said softly, "that there was something meant to be found by the wrong person." He stared at her. "Are you suggesting Drake staged his own death?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Mr. Drake is quite dead. But I believe he planned a final performance of sorts, one that depended on others playing their parts precisely. He was a manipulative man, Inspector. He understood people's weaknesses. He likely intended to expose or ruin someone, and that person struck first." Craddock looked skeptical but intrigued. "So who had the most to lose?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she poured another cup of tea and gazed out the window at the rain-speckled lane. The answer lies not in what was taken, but in what was left behind, she said at last. Mrs. Wentworth's letters, the money, they were bait. The true secret was something much quieter. She set her cup down. Tell me, Inspector, have you examined the sheet music found near the body? Yes, the coroner passed it to us. A few bars of something unfinished. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Not unfinished, Inspector, disguised. The message I found, debt paid, was part of it. But there must have been more. Mr. Drake was telling us something, in the only language he trusted, music. Craddock, though weary, could not help but smile. Then we'll have the rest analyzed. I should like to see it myself, Miss Marple said gently. I've a friend in the church choir who reads notation rather well. Between us, we might translate what Mr. Drake meant to say. That evening, after Craddock left, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage under her umbrella. Inside, the drawing-room glowed warm with lamplight. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, listened attentively as Miss Marple explained, her fingers tracing the peculiar marks across the staves. After some time, Mrs. Clement looked up. It isn't a melody at all. The notes correspond to letters. Here, look. Each phrase spells a word. Arthur, account, forgery, and this last bit, proof enclosed. Miss Marple's heart gave a small flutter of satisfaction. So Mr. Drake intended to expose Arthur Denham after all, she murmured. The debt he referred to was not money, but guilt. He had proof that Denham forged something, perhaps the documents that ruined their business years ago. Proof he kept hidden until he decided to use it. But if Denham came that night, Mrs. Clement said softly, and discovered what Drake had, he might have killed him. Yes, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, but there's a flaw in that theory. If Denham were the killer, he'd have taken the evidence with him. Instead, the coded message was left behind. That suggests someone else found it, and wanted the blame to rest on him. She rose, pulling her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. Thank you, dear. You've been most helpful. I think I shall pay a brief visit to the Finch household. The rain had stopped when she reached the small cottage. Mrs. Finch answered the door at once, her eyes wide and weary. Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful. I can hardly sleep for thinking of it. I dare say it's been difficult, Miss Marple said gently, though you've been most helpful to the police. Still, there's one little thing I wondered. Did your brother ever come to the parsonage the evening before Mr. Drake died? The woman froze, her hand tightening on the doorframe. My brother? No, miss, certainly not. Why should he? Miss Marple regarded her kindly, but her voice was firm. Because, my dear, I believe he found something he wasn't meant to. Something Mr. Drake hid in his briefcase. A letter, perhaps, or a document. And in trying to keep it quiet, he may have made matters far worse. Mrs. Finch's eyes filled with tears. He only meant to protect me, she whispered. Mr. Drake, he threatened to tell the police about my brother's time in prison, said he'd ruin us both if I didn't help him. But my brother, he just lost his temper, that's all. He pushed him. It was an accident. Miss Marple sighed softly, her expression grave but not unkind. Yes, I thought as much. Poor Mr. Finch. A man can carry shame a long way before it breaks him, but even accidents, you see, have a way of revealing what lies beneath. Outside, the rain began again, soft, steady, and unrelenting, as if the village itself were trying to wash away what it had learned. Miss Marple stood for a long moment at the gate before turning homeward, her umbrella lifted high, her thoughts quietly ordering themselves for the final truth she would soon reveal. Miss Marple walked home slowly through the soft drizzle, her umbrella glistening under the gaslight. The lane was quiet, the kind of silence that made every footstep sound like a secret being told. Behind lace curtains, she could see faint shapes moving, villagers who by now had woven their own versions of the tragedy. But Miss Marple's mind was not on gossip. It was on Mrs. Finch's trembling hands, and the half-truth she had just confessed. There was guilt there, yes, but not the sort that belonged to a killer. No, Mrs. Finch was shielding someone, but perhaps not the brother she had spoken of. When she reached her cottage, she found Inspector Craddock waiting, his coat damp from the rain. "You were right, Miss Marple," he said gravely, as she ushered him inside. "Finch confessed, said he went there that night, argued with Drake, and Drake fell against the piano during the scuffle. Claimed it was an accident, but I don't buy it. There's too much that doesn't fit." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, removing her gloves. "No, it doesn't fit at all. Mr. Finch doesn't strike me as a man who plans. He reacts. And the piano, Inspector, was no accident. It was a symbol. Mr. Drake's death was orchestrated with a kind of irony only someone who understood him intimately could devise." Craddock frowned. "Someone who knew his habits? His vanity, perhaps." "Exactly," Miss Marple said softly. "Someone who knew the piano was his pride, his stage, his instrument of manipulation. He was found beside it because he was meant to be, a final act in a play he didn't write." She poured tea for them both, her manner calm, but her eyes alight with purpose. "Mrs. Finch's brother might have quarreled with him, even struck him, but he didn't kill him. I think he arrived too late. Mr. Drake was already dying." Craddock blinked. "Already dying?" "Yes. Poison, perhaps. Something quiet, something easily administered in a drink. You remember Mrs. Finch said she left tea for him before she went to bed? A kind woman's habit, but it's what every visitor would expect. And what if someone else came later, knowing exactly how to use that kindness?" Craddock stared. "You're suggesting the tea was poisoned, and Mrs. Finch didn't know?" "Oh, I'm certain she didn't, but she might have left the tray ready. And if someone slipped in later, say, a woman with access to the house and reason enough to finish what blackmail and shame had started, she could have poured it herself." "Mrs. Wentworth," Craddock murmured. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, she had both motive and opportunity. Her first visit was the prelude, her second the performance. When Drake threatened to expose her letters, she panicked. She knew Finch's family secret. Drake was fond of sharing such things, and she used it. She visited again after midnight, entered through the unlocked back door, poured the poisoned tea, and waited. When he slumped, she set the scene to look like a heart attack, arranging his hand on the keys. It was tidy, too tidy, but when she tried to take back her letters, she found Mr. Finch there and fled before she could. The vase, the lipstick, the open briefcase, they were her final touches, meant to confuse the scene. But she overlooked one thing. Craddock leaned forward. "And what was that?" "The music," Miss Marple said softly. "Drake's own handwriting. He'd begun composing his confession before she ever arrived. The message was meant for the police, a final warning that the man he feared, Denham, was only part of the story. The real danger was much closer to home." The inspector exhaled slowly, the realization dawning in his eyes. "We still have the teacup," he said. "We'll have it tested." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You'll find traces of digitalis, I believe, something she could have easily obtained under the pretext of her husband's heart condition. It's rather poetic, in a dreadful sort of way." The following morning, confirmation came just as she had predicted. The cup bore remnants of the poison, and Mrs. Wentworth's fingerprints on the rim. Craddock brought the news himself, though there was little satisfaction in his tone. "She's confessed," he said quietly. "Said it wasn't supposed to go so far. Claimed she only meant to frighten him, make him ill, force him to destroy the letters. But the dosage was too high." Miss Marple sighed, stirring her tea. "People often tell themselves that, Inspector. It softens the shape of guilt, but it doesn't alter its weight." He nodded, standing to leave. "You know, Miss Marple, Sometimes I think you solve these things before anyone else even suspects there's a crime. She smiled modestly. Oh, not at all, my dear. It's simply that people like music follow certain patterns. Once you know the tune, it's rather easy to hear when someone's playing false. When he was gone, she sat in silence for a while, listening to the steady ticking of the clock and the faint whisper of rain against the window pane. The village would soon return to its ordinary rhythms, gardens, teas, and gossip, but a certain quietness would linger in the air around the old parsonage. Miss Marple looked toward her piano, which stood neatly closed in the corner. "Poor Mr. Drake," she murmured. "He played too many notes too loudly, and forgot that even the softest ones can carry the deadliest tune." Outside, the rain eased to a drizzle once more, washing the last traces of scandal from the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple, ever composed, took up her knitting again, her thoughts already drifting to the small and curious puzzles that life in the village so reliably provided. The following days in St. Mary Mead carried that uneasy hush that settles after a tragedy has found its conclusion. Windows once alive with speculation now framed cautious faces, and the village, though outwardly restored to order, seemed to tread softly, as if sound itself might stir the ghosts of the night Mr. Drake died. Miss Marple, however, was not yet entirely at rest. Her manner remained serene, her smile as mild as ever, yet her eyes carried that alert stillness of thought that precedes the final knot being tied. For even though Mrs. Wentworth had confessed, even though the tests had confirmed the poison, one question continued to hum faintly in her mind, like the last unresolved chord of a nocturne. It came back to her while she was watering her geraniums the next morning. Something about Mrs. Finch's story, about her brother's accident, had not sat comfortably. People rarely lie outright, Miss Marple knew. They merely arrange the truth in ways that make it less painful to look at. And there had been fear in Mrs. Finch's voice, yes, but not the sort born from guilt. It was the fear of someone who had seen more than she should, and understood too late what it meant. She decided to visit the old parsonage one last time. The police had finished their work there, and the place stood empty once more, its shutters drawn, the piano still and silent. A fine layer of dust had already begun to settle across the floor, softening the outlines of the room where death had come so quietly. Miss Marple crossed to the piano, her fingers brushing the keys. They gave a faint, mournful echo. It was then that she noticed a mark on the lid, barely visible under the thin dust, as though someone had once placed a small, square object there. Not a vase, something heavier. She bent closer and saw the faint outline of 4 metal feet. A box, perhaps, a strong box. Her gaze moved to the cupboard beneath the window, where a subtle groove marked the wood along the bottom edge. Kneeling carefully, she pressed it. A hidden compartment clicked open with surprising ease, revealing a shallow recess, and within it a narrow tin box, its clasp broken. Inside lay several folded documents yellowed with age. Letters, business papers, and one more sheet of music. Written in Drake's neat hand, the title at the top read, "Requiem for a Debt." Beneath it, instead of notation, ran words written in his careful script. "If I die before this is heard, the hand that strikes the final note will belong to one who owed me more than money." Miss Marple read the line twice before closing the box. She knew then that Mrs. Wentworth's confession had been only a part of the truth. The poison had indeed been hers, but someone else had seen the opportunity to ensure it did what chance might have spared. When she returned to her cottage, she sent a note to Inspector Craddock, asking him to call at his earliest convenience. He arrived that evening, curious but weary. "I thought we'd put this to bed, Miss Marple," he said with a sigh. "Mrs. Wentworth's in custody, the evidence is sound." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, it is sound, Inspector, but it does not sing quite the right tune." She placed the recovered papers before him. These were hidden in a recess behind the piano. Among them, is a letter from Mr. Drake to Arthur Denham dated 3 days before his death. It says, in essence, that he means to clear Denham's name, that he has found proof the forged signatures in their old business were not Arthur's, but another's. The handwriting matches Mrs. Finch's brother. Craddock stared at her. Finch forged them? Years ago when he worked as a clerk, Miss Marple said softly. Drake discovered it, kept the evidence, and used it to keep the Finches under his thumb. Mrs. Wentworth poisoned him out of fear. Mr. Finch came later that night to retrieve the papers that damned him, and finding Drake weak but still alive, ensured silence with one fatal push. 2 debts paid, you see, one in fear, the other in desperation. Craddock ran a hand through his hair. So both are guilty. Each in their own way, she said. One sinned by calculation, the other by panic, and poor Mrs. Finch carried the burden for them both. He looked down at the documents again, then at her. You're remarkable, Miss Marple. You always see the pattern before anyone else hears the melody. Oh, I don't see patterns, she said modestly, pouring him tea. I merely notice how people behave. They are very much like music, Inspector. Each has their own tempo, their key, their dissonances. You only need to listen long enough to know when one note falls out of place. Outside, the church clock began to chime softly across the damp air. St. Mary Mead, as it always did, was already returning to its tranquil rhythm. The next morning the papers would speak of a tragic affair, of jealousy and deceit. But for the villagers, life would resume, baking, gardening, gossiping. As for Miss Marple, she finished her tea, set down her cup, and looked toward the quiet window. The piano at the old parsonage would be sold, she supposed. Someone else would play it, none the wiser to the tune it had carried after midnight, and with a small, contented sigh she took up her knitting once more, the needles clicking softly like the ticking of time itself, while beyond the hedge, the village of St. Mary Mead dreamed again of peace, never knowing how narrowly it had escaped the discord beneath its own gentle song. The days that followed brought a strange, wistful calm to St. Mary Mead. The story of Lionel Drake's death drifted through the village like smoke, never quite vanishing, yet growing thinner with every retelling. By the time the inquest was concluded, most had settled on a version of events that suited their temperament. Mrs. Price Ridley declared it the result of modern immorality. Colonel Melchett called it a dashed pity but inevitable when women get sentimental. Mrs. Bantry, of course, insisted she had suspected something was wrong from the very start. Miss Marple said nothing. She sat in her garden among the roses, her shawl drawn close, the faint smile on her lips revealing nothing of her thoughts. But inside her mind turned over the final, delicate truths that no one else would ever fully understand. She had attended the inquest quietly, knitting in her lap, her presence unremarked by most. Mrs. Wentworth had looked pale and resigned, her confession reduced by her solicitor to an act of fearful impulse. Her sentence would be lenient, Miss Marple knew. Society forgave women who acted out of panic, particularly when they did so prettily. Arthur Denham, cleared at last of all suspicion, had left the village without a backward glance. His reputation barely salvaged, but his conscience less so. And poor Mrs. Finch, her eyes hollow, her hands trembling, had wept softly as her brother was led away, charged with manslaughter. The law, Miss Marple thought, might see only the crime, but it was the conscience that bore the punishment long after. She reflected on the curious symmetry of it all. Drake's life had been built upon manipulation. He had played people as deftly as his beloved piano, each note chosen to draw out guilt, fear, or devotion. In the end, it was fitting that he should die by the very melody he had composed himself, a symphony of secrets, deception, and pride. The evening after the verdict, Inspector Craddock came to call. He looked tired, but there was a quiet respect in his manner. "It's done," he said, accepting a cup of tea. "Not tidy, perhaps, but done. I suppose there's no such thing as a neat ending in cases like this." Miss Marple smiled faintly. No, Inspector. Life is never as neat as we would wish it. The truth tends to trail loose threads, and people seldom mend as neatly as a piece of fabric. He chuckled softly, gazing into the fire. Do you ever tire of it, Miss Marple? Seeing what others don't? Knowing how dreadful people can be? She paused, her knitting needles stilling. Oh, my dear, one mustn't think too harshly of human frailty. I find it rather comforting in a way. Every wickedness is only an extreme of something quite ordinary. A little jealousy, a little greed, a little fear. Once one understands that, one can forgive almost anything. He looked at her with quiet admiration. You're remarkable. Not at all, she said lightly. Just observant. I've had years of village life to practice. Nothing hones one's insight like a jumble sale committee or a church bazaar. When he left, Miss Marple sat for a long time by the window, watching the twilight settle over the village. The rain had stopped, and a clear pale moon hung above the chimneys. Somewhere in the distance, a single piano note drifted through the night, someone practicing perhaps in one of the cottages. The sound lingered, trembling faintly on the air before fading into silence. She smiled, not with fear, but with that quiet satisfaction of knowing that life, with all its cruelties and comforts, continued. The old parsonage would soon have new tenants, young people most likely full of laughter and plans. They would never know what had happened there, or what music had played after midnight. And that, Miss Marple thought, was perhaps for the best. She rose, folded her knitting neatly, and laid it aside. The fire crackled softly, throwing warm light across the room. For a moment, she allowed herself to think of Lionel Drake, not as the villain he had been, but as a man undone by his own cleverness. It was, she mused, a kind of justice that needed no applause. As she drew the curtains and prepared for bed, her reflection in the glass caught her attention. A small, composed figure with silver hair and wise, steady eyes. She looked at herself as if she were looking at another person entirely, someone who belonged to the stillness of the village as much as its mysteries. Outside, the church clock chimed midnight. Miss Marple paused, listening to the echoes fade into the quiet. There was no music this time, no lingering note, only peace. And as she turned off the lamp, she thought, with a touch of fond amusement, that in St. Mary Mead peace was always temporary. Somewhere someone was already telling a story a little too dramatically, holding a secret a little too tightly, or making a promise they didn't intend to keep. But that, she supposed, was the way of the world and of people, and Miss Marple, who understood them all too well, would be waiting, with her knitting and her kind blue eyes, for the next quiet disturbance in the calm. The village of St. Mary Mead had, in its quiet and dignified way, resumed its tranquil rhythm. The old parsonage stood empty once more, its windows shuttered against the world, and the tragedy that had so disturbed its peace became, as all things eventually did in the village, another well-told story that grew softer with every retelling. But for Miss Marple it was not quite over. The final threads of truth always lingered, until they were properly tied, and she disliked to leave a story unfinished. On a mild afternoon, a week after the inquest, she paid one last visit to Mrs. Finch. The woman looked frail, a ghost of herself, her eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. Yet when she saw Miss Marple at the door, something like gratitude flickered across her face. "You've been kind to me, miss," she said in a small voice as she poured tea with shaking hands. "Everyone else looks at me as though I'd done it myself." "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you've been very brave, and I dare say you've paid more dearly for your silence than most pay for their sins." Mrs. Finch's lip trembled. "I thought if I said nothing it would all be over. But it doesn't stop, does it? The thinking?" "No," Miss Marple replied softly. "It never does. But the truth, when spoken aloud, loses some of its sharpness. That's the mercy of it." Mrs. Finch nodded, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. When Miss Marple left, the woman's expression was calmer. as though the burden she had carried was finally being set down. It was a small mercy, but Miss Marple had long learned that justice did not always need to thunder. It could whisper just as effectively. As she walked home through the lane, the village sounds reached her, the clatter of teacups, the hum of bees, a distant child's laughter. Life, she thought, had a way of smoothing its own edges. Inspector Craddock had closed the case neatly, the files sealed and stored, the names recorded. Mrs. Wentworth's confession, Mr. Finch's tragic involvement, the motives of fear and pride, all fitted together with the precision of a well-finished puzzle. And yet beneath it, there was something else, a faint moral melody, the kind Miss Marple alone could hear. She thought of Lionel Drake often in those quiet evenings, the clever, vain man who had so believed himself the conductor of other people's lives. In the end, he had composed his own requiem, a cruel one, yes, but also oddly just. He had played upon the weaknesses of others until those same weaknesses struck back, each note of his manipulation returning like an echo in a hollow room. It was, she supposed, the simplest lesson of all, that wickedness was never clever for long. Evil, she murmured as she reached her gate, is very dull once one understands it. It never creates, it only imitates. The roses in her garden were in full bloom again, as though untouched by the shadows of human frailty. Miss Marple paused, admiring their delicate perfection before stepping inside. She placed her hat on the stand, took up her knitting, and sat by the window where the light fell soft and golden. That evening, as dusk folded over St. Mary Mead, she heard it once again, the faintest trace of piano music drifting from somewhere far off, a slow, haunting tune carried by the wind. It made her smile rather wistfully. The sound might have come from any open window, any passing wireless, yet she fancied it was a final echo from the old parsonage, a ghostly note closing a chapter. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, the rhythm as steady as her thoughts. Another mystery ended, another truth uncovered, another lesson in the endless study of human nature. For in the quiet corners of the world, she knew people would always deceive, love, betray, and forgive, and she would always be there, watching with her mild blue eyes and her sharp, knowing heart. The last light faded from the sky, and she set her knitting aside, the faintest smile playing about her lips. "Ah, well," she whispered, "there's always another story waiting to be told." And with that, Miss Marple rose, drew the curtains closed, and left the village to its peace once more, until inevitably peace would falter again, and she would be called, as she always was, to see what others could not. The piano that had played after midnight would never sound again, but its melody lingered, soft, melancholy, and eternal, as a quiet testament to the truth that Miss Marple understood better than anyone, that even in the gentlest of villages, human hearts could still strike the darkest chords.